I stood beneath the massive crystal chandeliers of the Newport ballroom while clutching a cold microphone that felt significantly heavier than usual because I knew my next words would shatter my family forever. My name is Callie. I am 25 years old, and for the last 3 years I have carried the suffocating weight of a stolen dream that my own flesh and blood ripped away from me in a moment of pure, calculated malice. As I looked out at the 500 guests dressed in expensive silk and tuxedos, my eyes locked onto the woman in the white dress who was currently beaming with a fake angelic glow that hid the heart of a monster. She thought she had finally won by securing a marriage into one of the most powerful legal dynasties in Rhode Island, yet she had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collide with the truth I had been documenting since the day she ruined my life. The air in the room felt thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but all I could smell was the stench of the betrayal that had sent me fleeing from this city with nothing but a bruised body and a broken spirit. Every person here believed they were celebrating a union based on love and virtue, whereas they were actually witnessing the crowning of a thief who had built her happiness on the wreckage of my ballet career. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, while I prepared to reveal the video evidence that would transform this fairy tale wedding into a public execution of her reputation. Before I dive deeper into the dark secrets of how my sister mocked my failure after sabotaging the biggest audition of my life, I want to ask you a quick question to see how far my voice is reaching today. Please let me know in the comments what time it is right now and which city you are watching from, so I can see exactly how far my story has traveled across the world. If you believe that family should never be the ones to stab you in the back, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because your support helps me bring these hidden truths to light. I truly appreciate every single one of you for joining me today, so please subscribe now to become part of our growing community and ensure you never miss the jaw-dropping conclusion to this journey. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the house where the favoritism was so loud it drowned out my cries for help. The foundation of my resentment was built in a beautiful seaside house in Rhode Island, where my mother Martha spent every waking hour polishing the image of her eldest daughter while treating me like an inconvenient shadow. Growing up in the shadow of Felicity meant understanding from a very early age that my needs, my talents, and my very presence were secondary to her relentless pursuit of the spotlight. While Felicity was enrolled in the most expensive fashion schools and social etiquette classes, I was expected to spend my weekends working at the local grocer to help cover the rising costs of her extravagant lifestyle. Mom would often look at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, claiming that my obsession with classical ballet was nothing more than a childish fantasy that would never pay the bills or bring honor to the family name. She once took my first pair of professional pointe shoes and threw them into the trash bin behind the garage, telling me that a girl from our background needed to be practical instead of wasting time dancing on her toes. Felicity watched that entire scene with a smug grin on her face, leaning against the doorframe as she adjusted her expensive silk scarf that had been bought with money I earned scrubbing floors. My father Arthur was a man of few words who chose to bury his head in his newspapers whenever the tension in the kitchen became unbearable, effectively granting Mom permission to continue her emotional warfare against me. Even when I managed to secure a small scholarship through my own hard work, Mom found a way to make me feel guilty for taking resources away from Felicity's supposedly superior potential. There were nights when I had to practice my routines in the dark basement because Mom didn't want the sound of my music to disturb Felicity's beauty sleep or her long phone calls with the wealthy boys from the yacht club. Felicity knew exactly how to manipulate the situation, often intentionally breaking her own expensive belongings and then leaving them in my room so that Mom would have a reason to scream at me for hours. I remember one specific evening when Mom sat us both down at the dinner table and announced that she was taking the last of our savings to buy Felicity a designer dress for a debutante ball. When I dared to ask if there was any money left for the audition fees I needed for the National Ballet Academy, Mom laughed in my face and told me that I was being incredibly selfish for trying to steal my sister's moment. Felicity leaned over and whispered that some people were born to lead, while others were born to serve, a comment that burned into my soul like acid as I watched Dad stare silently at his plate. The unfairness wasn't just about money or opportunities. It was the systematic erasure of my identity in favor of a girl who had never worked a day in her life. Felicity had this terrifying ability to play the victim whenever it suited her, crying crocodile tears to Mom whenever I tried to stand up for myself or claim any small victory. If I received a high grade in school, Felicity would claim that she was depressed because of the pressure she felt, which would immediately prompt Mom to demand that I apologize for being insensitive to my sister's feelings. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a ghost haunting the hallways of a house that belonged entirely to the woman who gave birth to me and the daughter she favored above all else. Every time I tried to talk to Dad about the imbalance, he would simply pat my hand and tell me to be the bigger person, never realizing that he was asking a child to carry the weight of an adult's failure. The psychological toll of being told every day that my dreams were worthless was immense, but it only served to fuel a quiet burning fire within my chest that kept me practicing until my toes bled. I would hide my bruised feet under thick socks so Mom wouldn't have another reason to call me weak or tell me that I was ruining my body for a pointless hobby. Felicity would often walk past my room and make disparaging comments about the smell of my sweat or the repetitive nature of my practice, ensuring I never felt a moment of peace. As the years went by, the divide only grew wider, with Felicity being paraded around town like a prize trophy, while I was kept in the background as the reliable, invisible worker bee. Mom would introduce Felicity to all her friends by listing her latest social achievements, but whenever they asked about me, she would simply shrug and say, "I was helping out," or "finding myself." I wasn't finding myself, I was surviving an environment that was designed to break my spirit and make me believe that I was lucky to even have a roof over my head. The ultimate insult came when Mom told me that I would need to skip my final dress rehearsal to help Felicity pack for her summer trip to Europe, a trip that had been funded by selling the vintage jewelry Dad had promised to leave to me. That was the moment I realized that no amount of loyalty or hard work would ever earn me a seat at their table, because in their eyes, I was merely a tool to be used and discarded. I began to save every penny I found, tucking it away in a hole behind the loose floorboard under my bed, knowing that one day I would need to buy my freedom. I didn't know then that Felicity was already planning a way to ensure my departure was as painful and humiliating as possible. 3 years ago, the most pivotal morning of my entire life arrived with the promise of a fresh start at the National Ballet Academy audition, which was the only bridge leading away from the suffocating atmosphere of my mother's house. I had spent months preparing for this single day, pushing my physical limits until every muscle in my body screamed for rest. Yet I felt a surge of adrenaline as I checked my dance bag one last time before bed. Everything was perfectly organized, from my custom-fitted pointe shoes to the silk ribbons I had painstakingly stitched by hand, because I knew that the prestigious judges at the academy demanded perfection in every detail. However, when I woke up the next morning, a heavy and unnatural silence hung over the hallway, and I felt a cold pit of dread form in my stomach as I glanced at my alarm clock, only to realize it had been tampered with. The digital display was dark because someone had intentionally unplugged it from the wall, leaving me with less than 30 minutes to reach the city center before the registration gates closed forever. I scrambled to grab my bag, but as I pulled out my pointe shoes to perform a final check, my heart stopped when I saw that the satin ribbons had been shredded into useless threads and the hard shanks had been snapped in half. I stood there trembling in the middle of my room while realizing that Felicity was the only person who could have entered my space to commit such a heartless act of sabotage. I rushed into the hallway to find my sister sitting at the kitchen table with a serene expression, slowly sipping her coffee, while Mom chatted excitedly about a shopping trip they had planned for that afternoon. When I screamed at Felicity, demanding to know why she had destroyed the only things that mattered to me, she simply looked up with a bored expression and claimed she had no idea what I was talking about. Mom immediately jumped to her defense, shouting that I was being hysterical and that my constant drama was ruining the peaceful morning she wanted to enjoy with her favorite daughter. I tried to explain that my audition started in 20 minutes and that my gear was ruined, but Mom just waved her hand dismissively and told me that if I were truly talented, I wouldn't need fancy shoes or an alarm clock to succeed. Dad looked up from his newspaper for a fleeting second, his eyes filled with a brief flash of sympathy, but he quickly looked away when Mom glared at him, signaling that he should remain silent as usual. I had no choice but to grab my backup shoes, which were old and lacked the proper support for the complex variations I was expected to perform in front of the world-class instructors. I sprinted out of the house and drove like a maniac toward the academy, but the universe seemed to conspire against me as I hit every red light and encountered a massive traffic jam that Felicity had conveniently forgotten to mention during breakfast. By the time I burst through the heavy oak doors of the audition hall, the head proctor looked at me with a cold and judgmental stare, while informing me that the late entry window had closed 5 minutes ago. I begged him for a chance, my voice cracking with desperation, as I explained that my family had sabotaged my arrival, but he simply pointed toward the exit and told me that professional dancers must be responsible for their own schedules, regardless of domestic issues. I walked back to my car with my head bowed, feeling the crushing weight of 1,000 dreams collapsing inside my chest, knowing that my one chance to escape Rhode Island had just vanished into thin air. When I returned home, I expected to find some shred of remorse, but instead I walked into a celebration where Felicity was laughing loudly while holding a new designer handbag that Mom had bought her as a reward for being such a good daughter. Felicity looked at my tear-stained face and let out a sharp, mocking laugh before saying that she told me I would never be a real dancer and that I should finally accept my place as the family's resident failure. Mom joined in the ridicule, suggesting that I should stop moping and start looking for a real job at the local warehouse so I could contribute more money to the household expenses. At that moment, something inside me finally snapped, replacing my sorrow with a cold and crystalline clarity that made me realize I would die a slow, emotional death if I stayed in that house for one more day. I didn't say a word as I walked past them and up to my room, where I grabbed the small stash of cash I had hidden under the floorboard and packed a single suitcase with my most essential belongings. As I walked toward the front door for the final time, Dad stood in the shadows of the hallway and whispered a soft apology, but I didn't stop to acknowledge him because his silence had been just as damaging as Mom's cruelty. I drove away from that house without looking back in the rearview mirror, fueled by a silent vow that I would return one day, not as a victim, but as a woman who had built her own throne from the ashes they left behind. 1 year after I stepped off the bus in Boston with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of resentment, I found myself standing in the middle of a dusty, abandoned warehouse that I had just signed a lease for with every penny I had earned, working 3 different jobs. The transition from being a suppressed shadow in Rhode Island to an independent woman in a bustling city had been grueling, involving long nights of scrubbing restaurant floors and early mornings of delivering packages in the biting New England cold. I had survived on ramen noodles and cheap coffee while sleeping on a thin mattress in a cramped studio apartment, but the burning desire to prove my family wrong had kept me going when my body wanted to give up. My friend Gavin, who was a talented freelance designer I had met during my shifts at a local cafe, had been the only person to truly believe in my vision for a modern dance academy that broke away from traditional elitism. Gavin spent his weekends helping me scrape the old paint off the warehouse walls and installing a professional-grade sound system that he had scavenged and repaired himself because he knew I couldn't afford brand-new equipment. He didn't just offer manual labor, he provided the technical expertise I lacked, setting up a sleek website and an automated booking system that made my small business look like a high-end institution from the very beginning. I remember the night we finally finished laying down the sprung wood floors, a project that had taken us nearly 3 weeks of back-breaking labor to ensure the surface was safe for high-impact ballet movements. Gavin stood back with a proud smile and told me that this space was going to change the lives of hundreds of young dancers who had been told they weren't good enough, just like I had been told back home. I didn't want my studio to be just another place for technical training. I wanted it to be a sanctuary for those who had been overlooked or discouraged by people like my mother and sister. As word began to spread about my unique teaching style and the inclusive atmosphere of my studio, the classes started to fill up with eager students from all walks of life. I poured every ounce of my soul into my students, watching them grow in confidence and skill, while I slowly began to heal the deep wounds that Felicity had inflicted on my own self-esteem. Despite the growing success and the financial stability I was finally achieving, I never once reached out to my family to brag about my accomplishments or seek their validation. However, I couldn't completely sever the ties to my father, who I knew was struggling under the weight of Mom's increasingly expensive demands and the debts Felicity was racking up at her fashion school. Through a series of discreet bank transfers, I began sending large sums of money back to Rhode Island, ensuring the payments were marked as anonymous gifts so that Mom wouldn't know the source of her sudden financial relief. I paid off the mortgage arrears that had been threatening to take their house and covered the cost of Dad's rising medical insurance premiums without ever asking for a thank you or a phone call in return. It was a strange and complicated form of revenge, knowing that I was the one keeping their heads above water while they continued to believe I was a struggling failure in the big city. Gavin often questioned why I was helping the very people who had tried to destroy me, but I explained that I didn't want to be like them, consumed by greed and a lack of empathy for those in need. My success was the ultimate shield, and every dollar I sent home was a silent testament to the fact that their predictions about my life had been completely and utterly wrong. By the end of that first year, my studio had become so popular that I had to hire 3 additional instructors and expand into the neighboring unit of the warehouse. I was no longer the girl who cried over ruined shoes. I was a respected business owner who was making a significant impact on the arts community in Boston. Every time I looked at my reflection in the massive studio mirrors, I saw a woman who had reclaimed her power and was no longer defined by the trauma of her past. Little did I know that my family's ignorance of my success was about to end, as Felicity was preparing to drag me back into her orbit for the sake of her own selfish vanity. 2 months before the extravagant wedding was scheduled to take place, the silence from Rhode Island was abruptly broken when my phone buzzed with a call from Mom that I initially considered ignoring. When I finally answered, she didn't ask how I was doing or where I had been for the last 3 years, but instead immediately began barking orders about how I needed to return home to assist Felicity with her wedding preparations. Mom informed me that Felicity was marrying Julian, a high-profile attorney from a family so wealthy that their name was etched onto half the buildings in Newport, and she insisted that my presence was required to maintain the image of a united family. Felicity then snatched the phone away, and her voice was dripping with that familiar poisonous sweetness as she told me that she had decided to let me perform a ballet solo as the opening act for her reception. She claimed that since I had failed to make anything of myself in the real world, the least I could do was use my little hobby to provide some free entertainment for her distinguished guests. I stayed silent while listening to her describe how she wanted me to wear a costume that matched the bridesmaids' dresses, a clear attempt to humiliate me by turning me into a glorified servant in front of 500 people. Felicity let out a sharp laugh and said that I should be grateful for the opportunity because Julian's family appreciated the arts, and it would make her look charitable for supporting her struggling, unsuccessful sister. The arrogance in her tone was so overwhelming that I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. But instead of hanging up in a rage, I realized that this was the perfect stage for the ending I had been dreaming of since the day she broke my shoes. I calmly agreed to her demands, promising that I would deliver a performance that no one in Newport would ever forget, which caused Mom to sigh with relief as she told me I was finally starting to show some family loyalty. After I ended the call, I immediately contacted Gavin and told him that the time had finally come to use the digital evidence we had been quietly compiling over the past few months. Gavin had managed to recover several deleted videos from our old home security system that showed Felicity entering my room on the night of my audition, but we also had something even more damaging. Through his connections in the tech world, Gavin had helped me gain access to a series of private cloud folders where Felicity had stored recordings of herself mocking Julian's family and laughing about how she was only marrying him for his trust fund and his social standing. There were voice notes where she called Julian a boring, arrogant snob and bragged to her friends about how she intended to drain his bank accounts to fund her own secret lifestyle in New York. I felt a cold sense of justice as I listened to her reveal her true intentions, realizing that she wasn't just a sister who sabotaged my career. She was a predator who was about to destroy an innocent man's life for her own gain. I spent the next several weeks working with Gavin to edit these clips into a seamless presentation that would be hidden behind the facade of my supposed ballet performance. Every time Mom called to nag me about the costume fittings or the rehearsal schedule, I played the role of the submissive daughter perfectly, even going so far as to send a large donation to cover the cost of the floral arrangements. Felicity became increasingly bold in her bullying, sending me daily texts about how I needed to lose weight or how I should practice more so I wouldn't embarrass her in front of Julian's prestigious colleagues. She even had the audacity to tell me that I wasn't allowed to speak to Julian at all during the event because she didn't want my low-class energy to rub off on him before they left for their honeymoon in Paris. I accepted every insult with a smile, knowing that every word she spoke was just another nail in the coffin of her reputation that I was carefully constructing in my Boston studio. Dad called me once in private, his voice sounding tired and frail as he warned me that Mom and Felicity were planning to use the wedding to announce that I was moving back home to work as their full-time housekeeper. He told me that Mom had already started telling people that my business in Boston had failed and that I was returning to Rhode Island out of desperation because I couldn't survive on my own. I told Dad not to worry and that I had everything under control, but I could hear the fear in his voice, a fear of the storm he knew was coming, but was too weak to stop. As the date approached, Gavin and I did a final walkthrough of the technical requirements for the Newport ballroom, ensuring that my laptop could bypass the house system and broadcast directly to the giant LED screens they had installed for the ceremony. I wasn't just preparing a dance. I was preparing a digital execution that would strip away Felicity's mask in front of the very people she spent her whole life trying to impress. The stage was set, the guests were invited, and Felicity was so blinded by her own ego that she never saw the trap that her failure of a sister had laid for her. The evening of the wedding at the Newport ballroom was a spectacle of excessive wealth that felt hollow and suffocating as I watched 500 guests mingle under the golden light of the chandeliers. I arrived dressed in a simple, elegant black dress that stood in stark contrast to the explosion of white lace and silk that Felicity was parading around the room like a royal coronation. Julian stood by her side looking every bit the prestigious lawyer he was, yet I could see a flicker of exhaustion in his eyes as Felicity constantly demanded his attention for staged photos and social media updates. Mom was fluttering around the room like a frantic bird, introducing Felicity to every wealthy donor she could find, while completely ignoring my presence until it was time for my scheduled performance. When the clock struck 8, the lights dimmed, and the master of ceremonies announced that I would be performing a special ballet tribute to honor my sister's union with the House of Julian. I walked onto the stage with a poise that I hadn't felt in years, feeling the eyes of the entire Rhode Island elite on me as I stood in the center of the spotlight, while the giant LED screens behind me remained dark for a few seconds. Felicity sat in the front row with a smug, condescending smirk on her face, leaning over to whisper something to Julian that clearly made him feel uncomfortable based on the way he shifted in his seat. I didn't start dancing to the classical music that began to play, but instead I picked up the microphone and looked directly at Felicity until her smile began to falter into a look of confusion. I told the audience that before I began my dance, I wanted to share a story about the true nature of the bond between my sister and me, a story that involved a stolen dream and a secret that had been buried for 3 long years. Mom tried to stand up to stop me, but Gavin, who was disguised as part of the technical crew, blocked her path while signaling for the first video to play on the massive screens. The ballroom fell into a deafening silence as the grainy security footage from our old house appeared, showing Felicity clearly and deliberately destroying my audition shoes and unplugging my alarm clock while laughing to herself. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the guests watched the angelic bride-to-be commit an act of such calculated cruelty against her own sister on the most important day of her life. I watched Felicity's face turn from white to a sickly shade of gray as she realized that her secret was no longer hers to keep, but I wasn't finished with her yet. The next clip that played was a high-quality audio recording of Felicity's voice loud and clear, describing Julian as a walking paycheck and a boring ladder to the top, while she laughed about how she would never actually love a man so predictable. She went on to detail how she had been funneling money from Julian's wedding account into a private offshore fund so she could leave him the moment she secured her share of the family inheritance. The prestigious lawyers and socialites in the room began to murmur in outrage, and Julian slowly stood up from the head table with a face that looked like it had been carved out of ice. He looked at the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with, and I could see the moment his heart turned to stone, as he realized that every word, every kiss, and every promise she had ever given him was a lie. Felicity finally found her voice and screamed at the top of her lungs that the videos were fakes, and that I was a jealous liar who was trying to ruin her happiness because I was a failed dancer. I didn't blink as I looked her in the eye and told her that she was the one who was the failure because she had to steal and lie just to feel like she was winning, whereas I had built a successful life without ever needing to step on her to do it. Mom finally broke through to the stage and tried to slap the microphone out of my hand, but I caught her wrist with a strength that shocked her, looking her dead in the eye and telling her that her reign of favoritism ended tonight. The guests were now standing up, some recording the scene on their phones, while others looked at the bridal party with expressions of utter disgust and pity. Julian's father, a man who commanded more respect than anyone else in the state, walked toward the stage and signaled for the music to be cut off entirely, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. He looked at Julian and then at the sobbing Felicity, before stating quite clearly that the marriage was over before it had even begun, and that his family would not be associated with a common thief and a fraud. Julian didn't say a single word as he reached out and took the microphone from my hand, looked at the crowd, and announced that the reception was officially canceled and that he would be seeking a full legal annulment of the morning's ceremony. He then turned to me and gave a short, respectful nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you for saving him from a lifetime of deception, before he turned his back on Felicity and walked out of the ballroom. I stood there in the middle of the wreckage of her perfect day, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a little girl, practicing in the dark basement of our house. Felicity was now hysterical, throwing her expensive floral arrangements at me and screaming that she would kill me for what I had done, but her threats felt empty and pathetic in the face of the truth. Mom was on the floor, trying to gather the scattered pieces of her social reputation, begging the guests to stay and listen to her explanations, but they were already streaming toward the exits in a rush to distance themselves from the scandal. I looked at the 500 empty chairs and the discarded silk ribbons, realizing that the ballet I had just performed was the most important one of my life, even if I never pointed a single toe. Immediately after the last guest fled the ballroom, the silence that replaced the music was more deafening than the scandal itself, as I stood my ground against the remaining members of my fractured family. Felicity was a crumpled heap of white lace on the floor, her expensive makeup smeared across her face in jagged lines of black and red, while she shrieked about how I had destroyed her future and her financial security. Mom was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her hands trembling as she tried to call Julian's parents, but it was clear from her frantic expression that they had already blocked her number and severed all ties. She eventually turned her rage toward me, screaming that I was an ungrateful monster who had bitten the hand that fed me conveniently, forgetting that I had been the one feeding them from a distance for the past 2 years. I looked at her with a cold, unwavering stare and informed her that the anonymous bank transfers that had been paying their mortgage and Dad's medical bills would cease at midnight tonight. The color drained from Mom's face as the realization hit her that the failure daughter she had mocked was actually the only reason they still had a roof over their heads or food on their table. Felicity tried to crawl toward me to grab my dress, her voice cracking as she begged me not to take the money away. But I stepped back, with a sense of revulsion for the woman who only valued me when she needed my wallet. Julian's legal team arrived within the hour to serve Felicity with papers demanding she vacate their shared penthouse and informing her that his family was suing her for the $80,000 spent on the wedding. They made it very clear that because the marriage was based on fraudulent intent and character deception, she would not receive a single penny of the settlement she had been counting on to fund her lifestyle. Dad finally stood up from the corner where he had been hiding, his eyes red with shame, as he walked over to me and tried to apologize for being a coward who had allowed this toxicity to flourish for decades. I told him that while I loved him, I could no longer be his shield or his bank account because his silence had been a choice that contributed to my trauma just as much as Mom's active cruelty. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back, hearing Mom's desperate pleas for me to stay and Felicity's screams of hatred echoing off the marble walls of the Newport estate. Gavin was waiting for me in the parking lot with the engine running, and as I climbed into the car, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying since I was a child. We drove back to Boston in silence, the neon lights of the highway blurring past us like the memories of a life that I was finally officially leaving behind for good. I knew that tomorrow the newspapers would be filled with the details of the Newport wedding scandal, and Felicity's name would be a punchline in the very social circles she had fought so hard to join. She would have to find a real job for the first time in her life, though I doubted anyone in the state would hire someone with a reputation as tarnished and radioactive as hers. Mom would likely have to sell the family house and move into a small apartment, a humbling reality for a woman who had spent her entire life pretending to be part of the upper class. I didn't feel a shred of guilt or regret for the destruction I had caused, because I hadn't created the fire. I had simply stopped being the one who stood in front of it to keep them safe. The justice I felt wasn't just about the ruined wedding, it was about the reclamation of my voice and the acknowledgement that my life had value regardless of their approval. I had spent years being told I was nothing but, as I looked at the skyline of the city where I had built my own success, I knew that I was everything they would never be. The legal battles that followed were swift and brutal, with Julian's family using their immense resources to ensure Felicity paid for every lie she had told during their brief engagement. I watched from a distance as her social media accounts were deleted and her fashion career vanished before it even started, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of her own medicine. My studio in Boston continued to thrive, but now it felt different, like the air inside was cleaner and the light was brighter because the shadow of Rhode Island was finally gone. I was no longer the girl who was defined by what her sister took from her, but the woman who was defined by what she had built for herself. 6 months after the explosion at the Newport ballroom, I am sitting in my new glass-walled office overlooking my third dance academy location while watching a group of young students practice their routines with a passion that reminds me of my own younger self. My life has transformed into something beautiful and stable, far removed from the constant gaslighting and emotional manipulation that used to be my daily reality back in that house. I have officially changed my legal name to distance myself from the Callie that my mother tried to mold into a servant, choosing instead to embrace the identity of a successful entrepreneur and mentor. Felicity is currently working as a housekeeping assistant at a budget hotel in a neighboring town, a job she was forced to take because Julian's family successfully sued her for every asset she possessed to cover their legal fees. Mom is living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment and has been forced to return to work as a